is what we were discussing last time.
Mhm.
And, you know, I think, so one thing I was asking about is how can you be conscious and aware of the source of all desires? It seems impossible. And you said, well, you do it within reason. Like, yes, we don't have instant access to all the source of all our desires. Like, what is it that is driving this impulse or motivation? It's not that easy to introspect and directly know what that is. And so you just try and do it one, I guess, where the restrictions allow you. So if you've got enough time to think it over, um, and two, it where the decision is important in your life. I think we sort of, do you remember that? We sort of discussed.
Yeah, I would phrase that or think of it more in terms of hierarchy of value. That's a term Rand likes, where, I mean, just a ranking of your values, knowing what's more important than others. I mean, you have to keep that in mind when you're thinking too. I mean, of course, you have to keep in mind there's a limit to how many waking days you have or waking hours you have, and you have to categorize things as more important or less important. Sometimes you have to only reason so far, and then you have to move on and continue to something else. And you act within your best ability and your best reasoning, which is basically why we need reason. Because we have limited time, we need to weigh our options, rate what's more important, um, choose when to stop thinking about something and just move on.
Mm. Um, yeah, so hierarchy of values. Um, how does that? I'm still. I sort of I understand what you're saying. Where the hierarchy of values, like you've got a certain list of things in your mind, if you want to think of it that way, of things that are important to you, and you try and roughly gauge where each thing sits in relation to another. But
Mm-hmm.
then when what's the relationship to that and being conscious of all your desires? You're saying, okay, only be conscious of your desires at the upper end of the hierarchy. Like, for example, only try and understand the source of your emotions in relation to, say, family or a partner and work, or what do you mean by the hierarchy of value? You'd phrase it in terms of the hierarchy of values.
What I mean by hierarchy is just understanding what's more important. I don't think it would mean that um, you only need to consider certain things. And you're right to say that it'd be hard to keep in mind everything at once. So it's more like a way of organizing everything at once. So you don't need to think of everything at once to make a decision. You don't need to think of every single value you have at once to make a decision. You could um, keep in mind, integrate one value with another, like seeing how, say, your interest in gardening might relate to your pursuit of rocket science. I mean, you can't abandon just gardening only because you're doing rocket science, but you'd have to consider, well, in the long run, what's more important and how much do I even need to consider gardening in my decisions? Like you might only need to consider like, oh, what do I need to do to keep my tomatoes alive today while I go to class? It's not like you abandon class just to take care of your tomatoes. Like you have to keep in mind how your values relate to one another. It might not be obvious, of course, but you can relate your values together. Say like, what does your pursuit of gardening have to do with rocket science, if any? Can you uh, take out some considerations or not think about every consideration when you're trying to measure what's important about those different values?
uh, so when you say when you're measuring the different values, it's important not to take out the different considerations. Are you saying that
Okay,
when
let me take a
considering?
step back for a moment from that then. I'm thinking more about how Rand thinks of, I mean, I'm not going to go into epistemology really deep here, but this would relate to her idea of concepts where a concept is kind of consolidating what you know. So you don't need to keep track of every single detail about the thing. Like you don't need to know every detail about a tree to have a concept of tree or recall a tree. it contains things so your mind can deal with it. And that's the idea of principles within ethics as well, because it condenses what you know into a single thing. So you don't need to consider every single detail when you think about, say, morality. You don't need to think of every moral detail in your life. And the same thing could be for values. Like if you see something as a value, you could condense it in a way that you take the essential aspects of what makes it a value, and you can abstract away some details. That way you can handle it. And if you're just a more simple example would be like, if you're trying to decide if you want chocolate or vanilla ice cream, like you might not think of every single detail of what vanilla tastes like, but you get a sense of what vanilla is, what chocolate is, and then you can make a decision. But then you could imagine on a wider scale, like comparing careers, like what kind of details do you need to know when pursuing different goals? I mean, I would say the more important something is, the more details you need to consider because it affects more things in your life.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I understand that. I understand what you're saying. I've heard that from School of Life as well, taking that approach on introspecting into what you like, and then trying to abstract away the qualities or the characteristics that make it appealing to you rather than just the specific thing itself. Like, if you like the car. So I've heard that view before. So then, okay, you've explained to me, you've sort of talked about principles and why they're necessary just now. And so you were talking about that because that is what the hierarchy of values is. It's a certain principle with which you then approach life. Because I'm trying to connect everything back, right? So we talked about principles, and then before that was hierarchy of values, and then that in relation to her wording was something like know the source of all your desires. I'm trying to connect it back to, knowing self-knowledge in terms of knowing the source of all your desires. So from that, we went to hierarchy of values and to principles.
Yeah, what the point I was trying to make is more that having the concept of value or everything. Yeah, I guess you could think of it a bit like a principle, because the principle being that you have a hierarchy of values and you should consider those. Maybe it's more like that's an organizing principle of your ideas. I think that might be a more accurate way to put it. And then a principle is something else. A principle being just how to think rather than what to think. I would say hierarchy of values is more like a concept or an idea.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's also a way. I'll go ahead.
Continue.
It's also a way of framing, at least the way Rand tends to think about values. And it's always a lot of talk about like hierarchy of values and knowing what's important and rating things in that way and understanding, rather than strictly saying what's the important values, like what are the values, as much as how do the values fit within your life.
Yeah, okay. And so that's a question. And so in relation to self-knowledge or knowing the source of all desires, is is that why you brought up hierarchy of values? Because you've got to know the source of well, do you need to know the source of the desires or the whole, like, yeah, anyway, what was so I understand the hierarchy of values, and I've actually got questions on that, I think, coming up too, but what was that in relation to, I'm still confused about that in relation to, remember this was the quote, so something like, a commitment to the principle that all of one's convictions, values, goals, desires, and actions must be based on, derived from, chosen, and validated by a process of thought, as precise and scrupulous a process of thought, directed by ruthlessly strict application of logic as one's fullest capacity permits. So, yeah, well, anyway, we said, yes, you try as much as you can, but then what is what's the hierarchy of value in relation to that?
I think that's more the consequence of after having judge this, that's what you end up with. That when you make a judgment about what to pursue and whatnot, is yes, you're saying is it good or bad, but you're also trying to decide, well, how good or how bad, I would say as well. Like, how important is that for your pursuit of life and your flourishing? That you have to be scrupulous about the way you evaluate things. And part of it's not merely judging things apart from yourself, but a hierarchy of value being that you're trying to think of values within the context of your flourishing, your existence. I mean, you would say the cardinal values are really at the top of that, because that really is what makes
What
everything.
values? Sorry?
The cardinal values, like reason, self-esteem, and purpose. So you could say those would be the top of a hierarchy, because you're trying to evaluate things for how they can help you do that. You're trying to be scrupulous, understand where your feelings are coming from. That might make it, or understanding where your feelings and thoughts are coming from, so you get a proper idea of like, well, how should you rate these things? How should you evaluate these things? To what degree are they bad? To what degree are they good? And you could see certain things are more important to you. There'll be some variation, but also some similarity. Like reason and self-esteem wouldn't change from person to person, but you might need to know specifics as well. Does that include having children? Does that mean you should be a scientist? Does that mean you should live alone? Does that mean you should travel the world all the time? Or it won't be exactly the same for everybody. So that's when you have to be meticulous and evaluate and really think it through.
Okay, so then basically you're saying that there are certain values that you strive towards that well, I mean, you'd need to be meticulous in thinking all of it through. Like, even if you're talking about virtues, if they're virtues you've read about and they're not yours, as in you didn't discover them, then you need to be just as meticulous in thinking them through as any desire that you'd have as well. Otherwise, you're just taking something on like you would something from the Bible, you know? But is what you're saying that, am I missing something? Like, okay, know the source of your desires, but also know, is what you were trying to add? Because I still don't get the reference or the connection to hierarchy of values in relation to this specific quote, not self-knowledge. Is what you're trying to say, yes, know the source of your desires, but also another important aspect is knowing the relationship of those desires to each other. Is that what the...
You might be making too fine a point on it. I'm not really trying to make any grand point about the hierarchy of values. It's more like just an additional principle to throw in there rather than really
Got it. Okay.
distinguishing thing. I mean, it helps you think about what values are. But really, as far as the quote really just focuses on the evaluating things in an integrated sense, in a holistic sense even, like I told you before. It's not just you're just thinking of one thing and unrelated to the rest. Like, you're really relating everything together. Obviously, that's difficult. How would you, like, relating how different values affect each other over time, and how different decisions would affect other decisions over time, and that's very difficult. And I guess Rand would say that because you need to do all those things, I'm developing principles to help you think about these things. That if you want to think about the source of your interest, the origin of your feelings, and the effects things would have in your life, you have to think about things in principle. You have to think about, say, selfishness or productivity or honesty. Those are the things you can think about and consider so you don't get overwhelmed. But yeah, that's what you do towards figuring out being that meticulous decider, that meticulous thinker. You use those principles so you can do it effectively and cleanly without being messy in your head.
Yeah, it's good. I've got questions relating to this. They'll come not long after these few questions that I have about the same thing of source of desires. So we'll keep talking about that for sure. But like, so there's a quote here, something like, she says something like, one must never act like a zombie, that is, without knowing one's purpose and motive, which is sort of a repeat of the original quote of,
Mhm.
reaching your conclusions through scrupulous logic. Um, but like, and we can use principles to evaluate ourselves and maybe to evaluate the desires themselves, but to know the source of desires, to me, seems like maybe a something for psychology, because it's not it's not like an immediate self-evident thing. Like if I look, for example, sometimes when I'm trying to figure out why I like something, it's not like I can look in myself and go, that's the source of that desire. It's more like I go through a certain process of reasoning, like I think it might be this. It's like a theory, and then something happens, and I'm like, well, it couldn't have been that because I don't feel the same thing in this situation. So, and then until you reach some conclusion of what is the source of this desire or feeling, it's hard. And so anyway, I think that's an area for psychology. What do you think? Like, it's not. I don't see how you can. It's very difficult. Anyway, that's all I'm.
Did Rand specifically say in that quote, "source of your desires"? I didn't remember it
Um,
phrased exactly that way.
I don't know if these are not direct quotes. So I'm
Yeah, I
not.
don't.
I'm speaking like more just trying to get at what would it mean to, like, how would you even know this? It just seems from my perspective, it seems impossible. Like at this point, I'm not talking about Rand, I'm going into
Okay.
psychology and broad philosophy broadly.
Broadly speaking, I would be inclined to say yes. It's more a psychological issue, knowing how the human mind tends to work when it comes to emotions. I think we could recognize generally that we react to things and like that we have reactions to things, and we could understand if by looking at a reaction we could say, well, I'm evaluating in some way. So when you slow down a second, like now that I have time to think about it, what do I think rationally speaking about that issue? Like if you were scared to get, say, surgery for something, you felt scared, then you could take a step back. Well, I might not know why I'm scared exactly, but I can think about and discuss whether I ought to be scared, whether I ought to be hesitant, whether evaluate the facts of it. And then you could see, well, if the facts don't line up with my emotion, I'm probably reacting to something about it. You might not be able to get down to the core of it, but I think there's enough within philosophy to say like it can guide us towards some start of an answer, but then a psychologist can guide you more towards, well, I have experience with these emotions or talking to people with these emotions, and I have more evidence with how to deal with it. So here's some more advice and ideas on how to overcome these issues, or how other people have identified what's been wrong. I mean, there's a lot of therapy techniques have to do with evaluating better ways of thinking, not just CBT, but even like or humanistic schools of psychotherapy, where you discuss the philosophical issues behind things. You're really getting at a way of analyzing, like taking the facts and relating to what happened as a result, which Rand kind of gets into that somewhat. I'm not sure if she really explains it thoroughly enough. She only scratches the surface about, well, you could form concepts about emotions, but how do we get any deeper than, are you ignoring your self-esteem? Like you can maybe look at the cardinal values and say, well, am I ignoring any of these? And if I'm ignoring any of these, it could be creating a conflict. Like if you're not regarding yourself well enough, you have low self-esteem, you say, well, if I'm upset about things regarding myself, it might have to do with self-esteem. Or if you're being lazy, you might think, well, do I have a physical issue, or am I actually avoiding something? Because that you can recognize, it can be very difficult, but that's what you would start with, like seeing how it impacts your values. I think that would be more what you would do, because your emotional reaction, according to many theories, has a lot to do with what like a prior evaluation would be. So you would just work off of that.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, let's because that's a deep, it's another conversation, I think, but maybe we can get into another time too. I'm definitely keen to learn more about that, and like for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is the next question I had was sort of something you touched on before, which is, this is the quote, and it relates to the cross-checking against the vast sum of your knowledge. So the quote was, this is not direct, I just sort of typed this up. It may be partially direct, but it's just one must never make any decision from any conviction. One must never make any decisions, form any convictions, or seek any values out of context. That is, apart from or against the total integrated sum of one's knowledge. And above all, that one must never seek to get away with contradictions. And I think you said, so my question was, this will be covered elsewhere, but how do you even cross-check against the total sum of your knowledge? Because like that's every single thing I know in relation to something else. Like that just seems maybe like a step at a time, but it just seems ridiculously hard. Like you can only hold like two things in your head at the, you could probably write a whole book about this.
I usually took that as more of a writing flair than really going into, you must go through every single little detail about cross-checking every little thing. But I mean, cross-checking I could take just to be like, just check it against your values. Don't do it on impulse. Just take a step back from it, or take a moment to think about it. Cross-checking to me would mean just seeing how it fits in with all your values. I mean, that would be the more rational approach, I think. Just, you are cross-checking if you're just comparing values, but that's what I was talking about with being holistic about how things are connected, like a web, like the web of your life, I guess you could put it. I think that's a metaphor more I made up, but like everything's still connected. Everything you know is connected. So you might not even need to check it against everything, even, because there's a lot of redundancy there. But you just need to check, like, is it contradicting something I know? Is it going against something I value? And if it is going against something I value, is it something I should think more highly of, or different things like that?
I suppose I think I got onto this in OPAR because I'm reading a book by Leonard Peikoff, and the start is all about epistemology. And I think it was the answer is something like, you like every new piece of knowledge you learn, you try and abstract away the principle or the essence of that knowledge, and then when you take in new knowledge, you relate it to that. But it's still, it's still difficult. Anyway, it's still, you cross-check values, but I can think of many scenarios where for example, let's say I read a book on finance, and the finance book has some theory about human nature and markets, and you sort of take that on, but then that contradicts something else you know about human nature or the way you act day to day, and so there's a conflict there, you just haven't examined it. And so there are probably many, and another thing that would be difficult, right, is like you said, check it against the facts that you know, but there are so many memories you have that you don't remember them right now. Like they might come up 2 years later and you go, oh, that's that thing, but that sort of contradicts this. There's got to be a systematic way to do it. Otherwise it's hard. Even when I've sat, reflected over things and tried to think up I've tried to think through a problem or a personal problem of mine. Like sometimes I've come up with a solution or an answer or a theory, like, okay, maybe I need to change this because I'm this kind of person, or I behave like this and it's better for me. But then it's been wrong because, and I only realized that because I just remembered something else that I didn't remember the first time, which was a fact that was always there. I just didn't remember it. So it must be a systematic way to do this, but it's not, yeah.
I would say that within objectivism, that's one of the kind of topics that are not really agreed upon exactly what the way to do that would be. That's really what I think any developments within objectivist philosophy really focus on. Like, how do we think about something more rationally? What are the rational ways of deciding something? And I mean, that really is, I mean, Rand is making the more general claim that it needs to be done, but she's not necessarily providing you with the method down to the detail you want.
Yeah.
Like, she's providing the detail at the level of principles and individual rights, and that's really the level she's thinking on. But if you want more specialized thinking, then you have to go dive into more specialized philosophy, like really like advanced theories of epistemology, which are some of the books I've told you about, which obviously you can wait a while before reading that, but they give you more examples of how to think more deeply and what kind of considerations you can make to make sure you are taking more into consideration and properly taking into account whether your own fallibility. You don't want to say that your ideas are always correct and you don't ever need to change them. All you have to do is fit your new ideas into it. Some days you need to see, well, how do I eliminate this contradiction that I had in my thinking and fix it in with what I'm learning now? And that's kind of really the hard part within, I think, objectivism, and how to deal with, well, it's almost the whole point of philosophy. Like Rand isn't going to be able to have every answer for that. So that's why you have this more specialized ways of thinking. And even things that maybe only you can think of because from your own experience and how your own mind works.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense. I'm happy going on these little detours and then just going, oh, okay, that's this field of philosophy. And then I kind of build up a, knowledge. Because then you mentioned to me, oh, this and this philosopher spoke about this. Then I have that and I can always go to it later, so it's still good. Even if there's no answer right now.
Right.
I want to go back to this never acting like a zombie. I know it's not literal, but I'm just curious, like, if we can just brainstorm a few more subtle ways that someone might sort of act like a zombie, because, the simple ones would be drunk, drugs, and what else? Drunk, drugs, checking social media on an impulse and just like scrolling through stuff. And what else? Like, can we think of any other
I can think of maybe some people who are extra depressed, maybe even through fault of their own, that like they're not trying to fix the situation that they create themselves. Like they're just sitting on the couch watching TV and just hoping something will come to them. Someone will give them a job offer or something without just sitting there. They can just sit there. I mean, that would be a kind of moral zombie. Like you're not really even thinking about it, you're just existing until something comes your way, which you can kind of exist in as a parasite, so to speak, but you're not doing anything. But that's the next best example I could think of. Maybe like a stereotypical lazy pothead, but not that the pot causes that, but just that you could just be lazy sitting around all day and not do anything. And not just because, go ahead.
No, continue.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best example I could think of. Just trying to think of anything else.
I agree with that. Even setting we talked about, I worded it as setting the frame. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but, like if I'm working and then I go on Facebook or whatever, social media, I'm just using that as an example, or email, and then I start reading an article intensely, I'm still in some sense a zombie because I've gotten there by not thinking things through, even though I am in intense focus. And so then in that same sense, you could be someone who's gone to a little cabin in the forest and you're smoking pot and sitting in a little hammock, but you've said, I'm going to just, dedicate a week to just relaxing. And so then that would be someone who's not a zombie.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, you're ready to think, and you set yourself up in a way that you're being responsible about it. I don't see any issue just on the face of that you described.
Yeah, another one might be someone who works very, very hard at a job to make money, but doesn't really know why he wants that money or like why
Yeah,
he's.
I would say that's more zombie-like for sure.
But it's super interesting because it's like a very aggressive, active zombie.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting way to put it. Like, you got the fast-running zombies that tear you apart, but then you got the slow zombies that are just bored and just walking around. They're both zombies, and they're both as destructive to each other.
So I guess just like, you look at a pet and they'll each have their own temperament even when they're babies. A zombie will have the same soul, but the behavior will be different. So you can't necessarily directly tell who is a zombie and who isn't a zombie.
Yeah, I think that's especially present in The Fountainhead with Peter Keating and maybe Gail Wynand. Sometimes he's kind of iffy, but you can see there's a certain emptiness to them.
Yeah.
Those are more pressing examples. But I think it's good to have Rand's fiction as a backdrop because I know you've read it, and I don't need to worry about coming up with other fictional examples of things you haven't read. But I mean, those are even really strong on my mind. Trying to think of other examples. Maybe especially like crime dramas. The villains, actual criminals, there's usually something empty about them. Have you seen The Sopranos?
Maybe ages ago, but I don't really watch much TV
Well,
series. So.
The context there would be just that you can imagine a character that lives a life of crime and organized crime and telling who to kill and whatnot. There's still a zombiness to them. They're still a bit detached from what they're doing. They're aggressive, they're mean, but they still have an emptiness to themselves. Like, they don't know why they really care about their life. There's nothing really driving them except just this vague sense of dedication to family. But they're still deep down empty. They're not thinking things through all the way, not thinking things through in a full context. And when you don't do that, I mean, that's what a crime drama can show you. What happens when you live life as a zombie, not in an intellectual sense, an intellectual zombie. It decays and disintegrates into chaos and death.
Do you think if you're Hitler, or let's go with Hitler. Do you think if you do a lot of bad things to other people, must you necessarily be a zombie? Like,
it's hard
that
to
is,
say.
you never know. On some level, you do not know the purpose of what you're doing or the motive for that specific thing you do to hurt people.
I don't think necessarily. I think it's possible to purposefully do those things with the full knowledge that you're doing it. It would be a rapid demise, but it could be done for a period of time, I think. I mean, it'd be like deciding, I don't want to live anymore. It's just a particular way of committing suicide. That's more what I would think of it as. But that's more like what you're thinking. Like, killing yourself does take a deliberate action. It's just some people want to do it in a more fanciful way. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it is.
I don't think you can purposely do that and have a decent life at the same time. it would have to be destructive, is what I'm thinking.
Well, that's also, you know, like a lot of the, what are they called? The murder suicides, where someone
Yeah,
like kills a family or kills, you know, people they love,
yeah,
or they, I don't really know to say they love, it's weird, but kills people they were in a relationship with, then kills themselves. It's sort of, I think that's,
yeah.
yeah.
But I mean, since you brought up Hitler, though, I think he was more a case of being a zombie because, like, drug use was part of his demise. A lot of drug use. That he literally, you could say he literally was a zombie with the amount of drugs he was taking towards the end of the war. A lot of heroin and cocaine. So, like, I think any example you could even try to think of in real life, there's really not people that have done something profoundly destructive that weren't also acting in a way that they turned off their thinking on some level.
Did you say there weren't?
Or I think I maybe misspoke. I'm saying I think anyone who's done something extremely destructive, they've almost always had turned their mind off at some point.
Right.
They were being a zombie at some point at least. They just weren't thinking, just letting things run their course, which for a time Hitler thought he was on the right track, but he decided, like, well, I'm turning off my mind now. And that's basically what he did. He did so much drugs, he couldn't think straight.
So, yeah, I mean that makes sense. If you think something is evil, if you categorize something as destructive, then that means you think it's evil on some level, right? And so,
And
if you do it in full knowledge, can you live with yourself? And so,
or
if the answer
more
is
like
no,
anti-life.
sorry,
More like anti-life is the way to put it, I think, in this case.
okay, anti-life. Why anti-life instead of?
Because, well, I was trying to distinguish between a way somebody might say, oh, this destruction is necessary because it's the moral thing to do for, I don't know, for breaking the Third Reich for it to last for eternity. Like, um, he might think that's a good thing, but you say, well, it was still against life the way he was trying to attain it, and that's more a way to focus on. It's not really just a matter of, is his moral code different, but what does his moral code do? It destroys. It doesn't make life better. It brings it down in some way.
Got it. So, in terms of people who are, let's say, someone who's like completely out of control and destructive, well, at some point they're just a risk to themselves and they might commit suicide or something. But the real fear then is zombies, basically. You got to
I
be
would
careful
say
of
so.
zombies.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good way to put it. And the mindless people are almost more dangerous than the people who think but are destructive. Like, mindless is the worst thing.
And I guess the difficulty here is, you know, when you say mindless, what's tricky is that obviously it's not mindless 24/7, otherwise they'd be dead.
Right.
That the
Right.
tricky part is that there's this mix of like no one's fully well, I don't know if I want to say fully evil because I don't know how to categorize that kind of thing, but no one's like fully so destructive and non-thinking that they're still here and you know doing stuff. Otherwise,
Right.
they wouldn't be in front of you. And so I guess that's the tricky part is like this zombie still does certain functions and still thinks about some things, like you know what are they going to eat or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, they're just on a bare level of functioning. I mean, at the more extreme cases. But yeah, I mean, that usually is a line of reasoning. I think Rand, I think she mentions it somewhere. I don't know which essay, but definitely, like, you wouldn't exist if you were being destructive. Like, either you're dead or on your way to death. Like, one of the two.
Right. And that can
It
vary
takes
from
time
human
to,
to
yeah.
human. Like, you know, Hitler can be on drugs all day and then he's like, oh, I want to have some of this Vegemite toast. And he just make himself, you know, some
Yeah.
Vegemite toast and has an orange. So in that moment, he's going towards life.
Yeah.
But, you know, in the bigger context, it's like, that's what's tricky about it, right? It's not like I can't just, yeah,
Well, that's another way to look at, like, thinking of things in the full context. It's like, yeah, Hitler's eating an orange and he's having Vegemite toast, and so yeah, going towards life. But in the wider context, like, what's he doing? That's not much of anything. I mean, like, one tiny good thing in a day of people on drugs, like, no. In the wider context, you're more bad than good.
It'd be really interesting now. I want to like pick up some fiction book on zombies and start looking at it that way. You know, like, this is what the zombies represent. They're a metaphor for non-thinking and just
Right.
people in your life who don't think much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, thinking that it also in terms of that help you remember what it means too. Like, now you have like an image in your head of what it's supposed to mean, being a zombie or zombie thinking. You could link all the other concepts to it that we've been talking about.
I wonder if the person who did first write about zombies had something like that was inspired somewhat by the non-thinking, because a lot of I think isn't a lot of myth, it's not reality. Like, you know, for example, I remember reading something about a myth of wolves. There's like a Middle Ages type
Mm-hmm.
myth about wolves stealing children, and the wolves didn't, you know, they didn't really interact with people, but it did represent like the fear of the forest or whatever. And so in the same sense, you know, maybe whoever came up with zombies also was kind of like representing, you know, mindless non-thinking, but we
Oh,
represented in the form of a zombie.
actually, I think it more referred to a form of slavery, actually, but also dualism because it comes from Haiti and voodoo. Voodoo, like a zombie, is like someone's been like possessed, or in a way they're dead to be controlled by someone else. So in a way they lost their mind in a way that they're not thinking anymore because they're more like a robot now. They're just being commanded what to do.
Just like a
That's what
non-thinking human driven by some motivation. Yeah.
basically, yeah, and that's how they're enslaved because the magic removes their mind basically from their body, and that's how they're commanded
Mhm.
within the Haitian lore.
There's one other thing which relates to this, which is she's talking about, okay, and then so this is the same thing about seeking convictions out of context, apart from or against the total integrated sum of knowledge. And above all, one must never seek to get away with contradiction. So similar to how we just discussed the zombie, I want to give specific examples, even more subtle ones, of how people get away with contradictions. So obviously the easy ones might be like, one, you drink, you take drugs because if you're like anxious or you don't want to think about something, it's an easy way to push that away, and you can continue getting away for at least for a time with that problem that's coming up. But what are some additional ways you might get away with a contradiction, more subtle ways? Or I think seek to get away with a contradiction.
I mean, the best cases I can think of is seeking to get away with the contradiction is sometimes within politics. I think it doesn't really, you could find any your favorite political example and think of somebody who said something they almost surely knew was false. They basically a lie, but not necessarily. Sometimes they could say two different beliefs, and hopefully you don't notice. I mean, that's maybe the best example I can think of.
I can think of another one too. Um, just now it occurred to me as you were talking about this. Um, if you believe something, or you emotionally want something to be true. So for example, um, I was thinking of that quote by Emerson. Is it Emerson? He said something like, the mark of an intelligent man is his ability to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time.
It's Nietzsche.
It's Nietzsche? Okay.
Yeah.
And so let's say you're someone who's like, um, you you have a partner, or someone has a partner and they say to them, "Oh, I love you," but then at the same time they say, "I hate you," or no, they don't say, I don't know. This is I'm trying to think of a way to put it that's too simplistic. But basically, what I'm trying to create a scenario where like someone feels something is true and wants it to be true, and then the way they try and seek, but it's so they feel they want it to be true, but it still doesn't really make sense. But then, so what they do is they'll just find some nice, neat explanation or quote, and that will be, like, oh, well, see, this person thought it. So, this is what I'm feeling is true, even though it doesn't make sense. That's another way you might seek to get away with a contradiction is find some explanation that is kind of smart, but not
Yeah,
necessarily.
I would say that's kind of what the point Nietzsche was making in a way that if you're really educated and know a lot about a lot of things, you're able to hold a contradiction in a way that you're able to be a hypocrite in ways that less smart people are not able to. That he's not necessarily saying it's a morally good or a bad thing. He's just neutral on that, but he's recognizing that it's something you do on purpose. It's not something that happens by accident. And but Rand, of course, would say, well, that's not only is that something, regardless of whatever amount of effort it takes to do that, you're still seeking to live by a contradiction. Doesn't Sure, you might be able to, but it's not going to provide any benefit to your life. It's not going to be part of your flourishing, and it certainly doesn't follow any of the moral principles you have. And you could say that the reason it doesn't is because, well, holding a contradiction would mean to some degree not recognize what's true or to avoid what's true, and just because maybe it feels better or it makes you feel less depressed or whatever it might be.
Maybe then the Nietzsche example is no good because I don't really, maybe I don't get
Yeah, I
that.
said it's more like
May-
a counterexample or a counterclaim to Rand, and that it's an interesting observation, but Rand has a good response to it, is how I would phrase it.
I'm trying to find you because that's what I was trying to capture there is maybe I used the wrong quote because I don't have enough knowledge of Nietzsche or anything like that. But um, I was trying to capture like, oh, there we go. I found it. So John Stuart Mill, so this goes back to your example of the politician and seeking to get away with a contradiction because I'm trying to find examples. So John Stuart Mill said, many a person remain in the same town, street, or house from January to December without a wish or thought tending towards removal, who, if confined to the same place by the mandate of authority, would find the imprisonment absolutely intolerable. And so a politician, like we've got a premier in Melbourne in Australia, Daniel Andrews, has confined everyone to their home for 23 hours a day, and you get like a $1,600 fine if you leave, and he reckons he's going to keep everyone in until December. Well, he might read something like that, and they've already been in there for a month, and he wants to keep going until they have 0 cases. So for someone like that, he might read a quote like this and go, yeah, it's fine. Like people are just complaining because and so there's still this information and things that are coming up, but you can just grab onto something and go use that as your little slogan to keep you going through whatever random feelings you have that are like throwing facts at you like this is bad, this is bad. Is that sort of more clear than the Nietzsche quote?
Yeah. For Nietzsche, if you have quotes by him, his quotes are usually meant to make you think more so than they are to make a point. So whatever they make you think of is not really the point he's making, but as much as what did it make you consider? It made you think about what it means to be a hypocrite or make contradictions. And that's the value of his quote. I wouldn't take his quotes usually at like I mean just take them as things that spark your interest, not deep quotes to have in mind.
One more example of seeking
Sure.
subtle ways we seek to get away with a contradiction?
I mean, those cover a lot of things, just like avoiding responsibility, avoiding honesty, maybe sometimes acting in an unjust way. maybe say with regards to racism, I'm thinking like a rabid racist, like a actual white supremacist saying like blacks are destroying America, like somebody like that. And they might be on some level trying to both say to themselves that, oh, there's something about, they're making a claim about racial identity, that there's this better and wanting their own right to make a choice, but then at the same time ignoring how that might apply to themselves equally, like kind of like compartmentalization, I guess I would say. That trying to think of blacks in one racial way, negative way, but then whites in another positive way, that would seem like, how could you hold both those ideas? Like it seems like trying to be biased in how you consider things, like not considering certain evidence against your side, but if it's convenient, accepting other beliefs despite the contradictions. So I mean, it could be an example like that, like say people have become not racist and like ex neo-Nazis, they tell stories about how they've changed their mind about how they used to think. It would almost seem like that what they were thinking before, like at first they were like maybe two-faced about it, like at the same time they thought it was right, but at the same time like, well, no, I'm still right about being racist, and like holding both beliefs at the same time. And eventually something's got to give. Either they find the truth or they just double down on their beliefs even. But usually I think people would find that at least contradictions are apparent. Like if you want to change your mind, in a way, it's like, well, there's terms in psychology for that. Usually has to do with, I forget the term, but when you feel like a discomfort about within yourself and just wanting to change your mind. And some people resolve it by like, oh, I'm going to learn more. Others might resolve it by compartmentalizing their beliefs.
Yeah, and then the other thing would be, you know, like with the example of the racist, you might try and look for knowledge which justifies complicated explanations or phrases or quotes that justify the one side you want to be true as well. That was what I was getting at with that quote as well. I want to go back briefly to responsibility, which you said. So avoiding responsibility, what is the contradiction? Like, what responsibility and what would the contradiction be that you're seeking to get away with? Like, let's take someone who, I don't know, what's an example? Someone who lives at home and, you know, they're in their 30s or whatever, and they're not really doing anything with their life. Like there's no specific reason that they need to be at home. And they're just kind of doing random stuff. I don't know, wasting time. So what's the contradiction? Like, you know what I'm saying?
We talked about that last time. And like when you mention it all like that, I'm not sure it is the best example of when a contradiction shows up. I mean, to a degree, maybe it's not as definite as like the racist example. It's not as clear cut because they might actually accept some of it. And that's why people get depressed sometimes, because they realize there's something not good about it. It depends if you talked about it with them, some people would deny it. Like, no, I'm not being lazy. It's just nobody appreciates what I do. Like, I'm not being lazy. I'm just taking a break. It's like, is it true? And some people might deny it in that way. Like, maybe they might really believe in their head, yeah, I'm just taking a break. But they would know if they're trying to live a contradiction, that they're trying to take a break, but also achieve something. It might not always be, I mean, it's definitely not as clear cut as the other examples, but I think if that's what was happening, that once you talk to them, it would be probably pretty clear what their frame of thinking is.
Do you think that you can seek to get away with a contradiction without doing so willfully? Meaning, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this well. Meaning, you behaviorally you're seeking to get away with a contradiction. That's the implication, but you just don't have the knowledge to. Like, so if you're a shaman and you're praying for the rain to fall, and maybe that's what you were taught. And I don't know what I've not met a shaman who's not, I've not met someone who's like only been in a little village and never gone out of it. So in that case, do you think it's possible to seek to get away with a contradiction, but it's not like you're actively, there's a difference between, say, praying for the rain to fall and you thinking it's going to fall versus someone who's like taking drugs and, trying to avoid thinking properly about something or trying to find rationalizations for something.
The best answer is it could be, because when we're talking about, because that has a lot to do with whether the person actually believes that praying will bring rain. On some level, maybe it is a lack of thinking, but it probably wouldn't be seeking a contradiction as much as just not thinking rationally. Maybe is the worst I could think of. Because if you're not thinking rationally, it doesn't necessarily mean you're seeking contradictions. It just means you're not thinking well. So I don't think that would really be a good example.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm with you on that, actually, now that I think about it. Cool. Let's I'll stop the recording because it's
Sure.
a good session.